Hi, my name is Phil Williams, and this is part one of Banyan's PMP Primer. If you are somebody who is planning to take an exam prep course or even to perform self-study, this four-part video series will help you develop a foundational understanding of what's important to know for the PMP Certification Exam. This is not a PMP certification course. This is a video series that just gives you a foundational understanding so that when you do sit for that course or do that self-study, you will have the foundational understanding to help you build on. So many times people have approached us over the years and said, I took this previous course and for the first 2 days I didn't know what was going on, and then the rest of the course I was lost. I felt like I had to catch up. It was a terrible experience. Or I tried to do self-study. I bought this expensive book. I read the first 2 to 3 chapters and I put the book down. I didn't understand any of it, right? That's unfortunate. It doesn't have to be that way. A lot of these people were experienced project managers. They had the knowledge, they had the ability, they just didn't get the right start. And so that's what this video series is meant to do, to give you that good foundational understanding so that when you do get into class or you do start that self-study, you hit the ground running from day one. You see processes and frameworks and topics that look familiar to you, and you learn more detail about those, and you're on your way. So there's 4 parts. This is part 1, and in part 1 is an overview. We're going to talk about the exam. We're going to talk about what's important and what's not important. We're going to talk about something called the Exam Content Outline, which gives you basically a roadmap of what you need to know when you sit for the exam. PMI created this, and if you're not familiar with it, you need to get familiar with it. There's a lot more detail that's not included in the Exam Content Outline, but it definitely provides a roadmap, and we'll go over that. It's also important to know that you have to fill out an application, and it needs to be approved before you can sit for the exam. So in part 1, we'll cover that also before we're done. It's a 4-part series, so in parts 2, 3, and 4, we will spend time going over the 3 domains that you have to be familiar with for the current exam. And those domains are people, process, and business environment. I'll leave the details to those future videos that you'll see, but I encourage everybody to watch all 3. It's less than 2 hours. When you're done, you will benefit. If you've finished these and you're headed for an exam prep course, you will definitely have the knowledge you need to continue from there. So without any further delay, let's get started with the PMP overview, part 1. All right, quick review. Part 1 is going to be a PMP exam review. That will be what we're going to cover in this video. And part 2 is we're going to focus on traditional predictive project management. Sometimes we call it waterfall. And that is going to touch on Exam Content Outline Domains 1 and 2. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Part 3 is our 3rd video, Agile Adaptive Project Management, Exam Content Outline Domains 1 and 2 again. And then part 4, we're going to talk about Business Environment, which is the Exam Content Outline Domain 3. Let's talk a little bit about the current exam. It is 180 questions. It is divided into 3 60-question sections. Total, you have 230 minutes of exam time. This does not include the tutorial that they will introduce at the beginning of the exam. This is a 15-minute tutorial. You don't have to sit through the whole tutorial. If you feel comfortable with how to take the exam, then you can exit out of the tutorial and start the exam whenever you're ready. But that 230 minutes does not include that 15-minute tutorial. There are also 2 breaks during the exam. Those are 10-minute breaks. We'll talk about those in a minute. And this 230 minutes does not include that break time. And it doesn't include the survey time at the end. At the end of the exam, once you've indicated that you're done, it will present a short survey, ask you questions about your testing experience, And so that is not included in that 230 minutes. So if you do the math and you divide the 180 into the 230 minutes, you get about 76, 77 seconds per question on average. Now, you're going to be performing reviews during the exam. We highly recommend before you take your break in each section, you review the questions you've already answered and see if you want to change your answer. So some of this 230 minutes is going to be spent doing your reviews. So we usually advise test takers to try and answer questions in about 60 seconds on average. Some will take you a little longer, some will take you a little less time, but on average try and answer questions about 1 minute per question. There are 2 10-minute breaks. Prompts to take a break will appear after question 60 and again after question 120. After each break, you will not be allowed to change any questions from earlier sections. So if you see 3 sections here and you finish section 1, you finished the first 60 questions, and a prompt comes up and says, do you want to take a break? Don't forget to review any questions you've already answered before you take your break. They're telling you that because once you take your break and you come back, you will not be able to change any answers on those first 60 questions. Same is true when you finish the second section. Question 120 gets completed. You're prompted, do you want to take a break? If you click, yes, I'm taking a break, at that moment you will not be able to touch any questions from 1 through 120. And so if you're going to review questions, you have to do it before you take your break, because you won't have access to those questions after your break. Why do they do that? Because they don't want people to step out of the room, go to their textbook, look up answers that they're not sure about, and come back and change their answers on the exam. And so this is kind of a new development in the exam. Before COVID, we only had testing centers. PMP exams were not offered as an online at-home option. When COVID happened and all the testing centers closed down, then they had to present an at-home option. And this is approximately a 4-hour exam, so they can't expect people sitting at home to not take a break during that 4 hours. So they've instituted 2 breaks during the exam. In older versions of the exam, used to be 1 question type. It was multiple choice. You get 1 question, 4 options, and only 1 correct answer. That has changed. They have multiple choice, but now they also have multiple response. Multiple response means that if you have 5 options, it would say choose 2 or choose 3. You also see matching, and where you will have to match items from one column on the left with items on the right column. This is fairly rare. You don't see that too much on the exam. There's also hotspot questions. This is where they'll show you an image or a diagram, and you'll be expected to click on the area of the image that represents the correct answer. This is rare. Also, there is fill in the blank, where they'll present maybe a question, and you're expected to type in the correct answer where there's a blank. This is very rare. So the vast majority of questions you're going to get are multiple choice or multiple responses. Just know that you may encounter some other question types like matching and hotspot and fill in the blank. Don't be surprised when you see them, but you'll use the knowledge you've gained from your studies and answer the question in whatever format they present. Learning resources. It's good to have a little background around where is this content for the exam coming from. And there's been a lot of confusion because PMI has had to do some Herculean movements in the last few years to transition from a very process-oriented format of the PMBOK guide to one that's more principle-oriented. It allows the PMBOK guide to be more flexible, and so it can address the various different project management methodologies that are developing out there. The PMBOK 6th edition was released in September 2017, and it was process-oriented, very predictive in its format. It had a little bit of agile content in it, but for the most part it's very process-oriented. It had 5 domains. initiate, planning, execute, monitor, control, and closing. Many of us are familiar with those. At the same time, they put out the Agile Practice Guide, which was about Agile best practices. Now, when you're preparing for the PMP exam, many people will tell you that the principal resource to study from is the PMBOK guide. And it is an important source of information, and it will give you the answers to many questions. But the PMBOK guide was never intended to be an exam prep book. It was a guide. It contained best practices for project management. The true guide for the PMP exam is the Exam Content Outline. PMI produces an exam content outline for every certification exam that they support, including the PMP. And so the most current version of the Exam Content Outline was released in January 2021. And the Exam Content Outline is the document that tells you what the exam is going to test you on. Now, the tricky part was that the current Exam Content Outline focused on 3 domains, not 5 domains. Those 3 domains were people, process, and business environment. And this caused some confusion. People weren't sure if they were supposed to pay attention to the 5 domains or the 3 domains. But if you ask PMI, they would say, focus on the current Exam Content Outline. So while it highlighted 3 domains, those 3 domains laid over the 5 domains. So they didn't necessarily contradict the 5 domains, they just operated across the 5 domains. Now, PMI comes out with the new PMBOK guide about every 4 to 5 years, and right on schedule, the 7th edition came out in August 2021. It did create some confusion because in the PMBOK guide 7th edition, they highlighted 8 domains. But again, PMI said, for the exam, focus on the Exam Content Outline. In the 7th edition of the PMBOK, PMI made a major structural change, shifting from the 5 process groups into principles. And principles allowed them to be more flexible, given the increasing popularity of Agile, which did not follow the 5 domains, and the fact that many companies still did follow the 5 domains. PMI had to take a position where they could support both methodologies, but not be rigid and structured. So for years, while they were very much aligned with the predictive waterfall traditional project management approach, they had to make a course correction and a major shift, and so that happened in the 7th edition. So the 7th edition really didn't highlight the 5 process groups like the 6th edition did. And so there was some concern, when they retire the 6th edition, where are those traditional organizations going to get their guidance on traditional predictive project management? As I said before, it's important to understand that the PMP Exam Content Outline is the key resource that tells us what practitioners are expected to know when they sit for the PMP exam. The guides are not created expressly for PMP exam preparation, but are considered resources for the PMP exam. The guides are part of a collection of publications from which content may be drawn for PMP exam questions. But still, a lot of organizations who use traditional predictive project management were concerned that if PMI retired the 6th edition, where would organizations get their guidance on traditional predictive project management? PMI solved that problem by creating the process groups, a practice guide, which was released in late 2022. It includes the 5 process groups and 49 processes from the 6th edition, minus the knowledge areas. So they kind of dropped the knowledge areas. They're taking a different approach. They're focusing more on the principles, as I mentioned earlier. And what that did is it took those 5 domains and all that structured content from the 6th edition and created a standalone practice guide, which will allow PMI to accelerate the retirement of the 6th edition, which is happening right now. So It's important to understand that the PMP Exam Content Outline is the key resource that tells us what practitioners are expected to know for the exam. Focus on the Exam Content Outline. So let's talk about the Exam Content Outline. We had mentioned earlier there's 3 domains. There's a people domain, which is 42% of the exam, focuses on project roles, building and managing teams, analyzing stakeholders. There's the process domain, which is 50% of the exam, focuses on planning, executing, managing, and assessing the project. And then business environment, that last 8%, managing compliance, delivering value, managing environmental impacts, and supporting organizational change. Now you saw that part 2 of this series is going to focus on traditional project management. And traditional project management applies to both the people and the process domains. But the reason we're focusing on traditional project management in that second part of the series is because it's good to understand the framework for traditional project management. And then once you understand the framework, it's much easier at that point to identify the people and the process components involved in that framework. The same is true when we go to part 3 and talk about Agile. Agile also includes people and process components, but it's important to understand the Agile framework. Then it's much easier at that point to identify the people and process elements of Agile. And so that's why we structured part 2 and part 3 that way. And then of course for part 4 of this series we focus primarily on the business environment. About half the examination will represent predictive project management approaches, and the other half will represent Agile hybrid approaches. So let's talk about eligibility to sit for the PMP exam. A lot of people need to know that there are certain prerequisites to sit for the exam. If you have a high school diploma, you don't have a 4-year degree or an advanced degree, they are asking that you have 60 months of unique non-overlapping professional project management experience. And so that's the first one, and that experience needs to be gained within the previous 8 years, and that 8 years is from the point you submit your application. You also have to have 35 hours of formal project management education. Now, if you have a 4-year degree or an advanced degree, they don't require as much experience. They're looking for 3 years or 36 months, unique, non-overlapping professional experience, and that again has to be gained within the last 8 years. And again, they want to see 35 hours of formal project management education. Now there's a third category here. If you have a bachelor's degree or postgraduate degree and you have a project management degree, and you can see there from a GAC accredited program. If you look at the bottom there, we have PMI Global Accreditation Center for Project Management Education Programs, or GAC. So people who go out and get a project management degree, the benefit of doing that is it takes some of the experience time off of their prerequisite. Instead of 36 months, they just need to have 24 months of project management experience. And they get a pass on the education requirement. So it's important to understand when you fill out your application, you'll have to indicate on the application what your eligibility is, and it has to fit one of these 3 categories. Submitting your PMP application, there's no cost to submit the application to sit for the PMP exam. There's a 10 to 15% probability that your application will be randomly selected for audit, where you'll be required to submit documentation to validate the education and project experience you documented in your application. So you will know the moment you submit your application, or several moments after that, if you're being audited or not. You're going to get an email from PMI that says, "We received your application. and we'll start a review, or you'll get an email that says, we received your application and you have been randomly selected for audit. And so if you're selected for audit, they will provide instructions exactly what you need to do to fulfill that audit. And essentially, without going into details, it was basically going to ask you to verify the project management experience and education that you cited in your application. If you're not selected for audit, PMI will complete the application review within 5 business days and email you the results of the review. If your application is approved, your approval is active for 1 year from the date you were approved. You may sit for the exam up to 3 times while your approval is active. So if they don't get through the exam the first time, they don't have to resubmit their application. Their application is still active. They just need to reschedule their exam. When your application is approved, PMI will provide a link for you to pay the exam fee. The exam fee is $405 for PMI members and $555 for non-members. So if you're curious what membership costs, well, for your first year, it's $139. And you can see there's a $150 difference there between member and non-member pricing. What PMI is essentially trying to do is encourage people to become members of PMI by reimbursing that membership fee in a form of a discount on the PMP exam. Once the exam fee is paid, you will be allowed to schedule your exam. When scheduling the exam, you have the option to take the exam in an approved testing center or from home under the supervision of an online proctor.